Okay, now we're going to be looking at our first uh, lecture at or on political parties. And political parties, of course, are Democrats, Republicans, Greens, American Independents, you name it. We do have political parties in the plural that are beyond the two main ones. The fastest growing group, though, is one that is a non-political party, and those are independents, and we'll look at those um, later. Now, what does a party mean? Well, simply, a political party is a group of men and women who seek to control government offices by gaining the winning position in an election. And uh, we saw that a couple weeks ago on November 4th when those people, those men and women who represented the Republican Party, uh, won versus the political party that was represented by men and women who lean or who have faith in Democratic Party principles. And we as voters who um, who choose between men and women representing Party A and men and women representing Party B, we don't usually vote the straight and narrow every time. We do over time change the way that we look at parties, and we may switch the party that we support based on what those men and women are saying that they support as far as issues go. But this is a pretty easy definition when it comes to looking at what a political party means. Now, parties are classified by three things: the party and the electorate. Now, we saw the party in the electorate November 4th. The party in the electorate, represented by Republicans, did very well. The party in the electorate, represented by Democrats, did very poorly. The party in government is represented by both, is representative of both parties. Um, right now, you have John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, who will be the new leaders of the party that controls Congress versus President Obama, who is the leader in the party that controls the executive branch. And then we also see what's known as the party as an organization. That means that we see Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who is the DNC chairman, or we see Reince Prince, who is the RNC chairman, the Republican National Chairman. And they represent the party as an organization. Now, forget about George Soros and the Koch brothers and all this. This has nothing to do with them. These are the party organizations themselves. It's not the PACs or anything else that are involved in the elections. These are just the party as an organization, sending volunteers out that represent the party, so on and so forth. But it really has nothing to do with with a lot of the things that we're going to see when we look at elections. And we also know that you know parties do a number of things. So let's look at some of these. So in the broadest sense, the parties do kind of six things. They give cues to voters. How should voters vote? What should voters be looking for when it comes to policies that are espoused by the party? Um, because we're going from left to right, and we'll go from up to down. They also articulate the policies that are represented by the party, and they're represented by the party leadership. So, in today's terms, you could talk about um, the Democratic parties stand on, let's say, Keystone or legalized pot or something like that, and you could then look at the corresponding Republican stands on the same issues. So both parties continue to articulate policies, and then they also coordinate policymaking. Now we've seen that in a very good way this week. The president's frustration, whether he's right or wrong, but the president's frustrations on not having a full-fledged immigration bill, so consequently the use of what we call executive orders in order to push forward the policies of the administration, and then to coordinate policymaking, especially at the executive branch level. Then we have a very, very simple term: linkage institution, and the parties are they are that middle foot between the people who vote for the men and women who run under the party moniker, and then what happens when those people are elected. So they're the linkage institution between the people and the government. So political parties, interest groups, elections, and the media are all linkage institutions, just to give you another reminder. Now, in order for parties to be relevant, and for parties to attain their goals, they have to nominate candidates. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad, but the party usually has to think that they are somehow electable. And so that's another one of the party tasks. And when they're not electable, when they carry a lot of what's known as baggage, then they are not successful. And then the parties run the campaigns. Now, what we have to remember that with excuse me, with parties, there's the National Party, part of the party represented by Reince Priebus and Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the Republican National Chair and the Democratic National Chair. But then there are 50 state organizations, and then there are county organizations, and then there may be, below that, there may be other organizations that represent aspects of the party. Now, do third parties have this? Well, they might, but they're also a lot less poor. They're a lot less organized. And it doesn't mean that a person who's not organized, as your book talks about Ross Perot in 1992, who ran without hardly any sort of organization in place. The flip side of that is Ross Perot didn't last past 1996, nor did his, for the most part, did his Reform Party last beyond that date. But what they do is they run the campaigns. They help run the campaigns. They coordinate. They coordinate in the primaries and find candidates to run in primaries and do all these things. So when you look at your book, which is page 243 in this version of the book, it'll tell you what the parties do when they do run campaigns. Now, the party and the electorate it's easy to ascertain what they do. You know, those registered for a party will likely vote for their candidates, and we see this. But this is kind of a tale of woe for perhaps, let's say, the party, the Republican Party here in California. The Republican Party has about 1/3 of all voters here in California, or a little bit less. They're not getting much more than that in the vote, though Neil Kashkari got almost 40%. But what the Republican Party has done is they've struggled with voters who split their tickets. The voters may like the national Republican candidates, but they don't like what the state party stands for with its anti-immigrant, cutting taxes and things like that. And the party itself has struggled with voters who might endorse the national platform, but don't endorse the California version of the electorate. And then the Republican Party has struggled with independents. And we know independents like the Republican message on fiscal responsibility. What they don't like has been the historic, at least in the last 15 years, the historic anti-immigrant focus on social issues like gay marriage, and so they have went the other way. And so when parties go off the rails, they struggle, especially with independent voters. And independent voters are somewhere between 25 and 30% of all California voters now. Parties have to modify their stands in order to attract that 1/3 of voters, let's say, that don't identify with either party. So the party and the electorate struggles, and when they nominate someone way outside the mainstream, as we'll see, then they're bound to lose. Now, also, what happens with voting and when people split their tickets, is that you're much more likely to get what we call divided government. Now, in California, we don't have that. What we have is runaway government because one party dominates, and so consequently, pretty much whatever it is wanted, it has gotten, and so we are the highest taxed state in the union right now. When we look at state income tax and property taxes and things like that. Where we look at divided government is on the national level. And right now, what we have and what voters feel very comfortable with is one party in control of the executive branch with the other party in control of the legislative branch. And that's what we have. The Democrats are in control of the presidency, the Republicans are in control of the House and Senate. And the feeling is that if the government is divided, then they can't hurt us. And that is an interesting development that is kind of gained some traction in the last 20 to 25 years, because especially since 1968, as we'll see in future lectures, the electorate feels comfortable with divided government. Now, when you look in your book, you're going to see things like the party image and party identification. Those are things that that you have to be aware of. One reason that at least until recently, the young had struggled with the Republican Party is their stand on social issues. They like the fiscal issue, but they don't want the focus, nor do they like the focus on social issues. Again, like gay marriage, abortion, and things like that. So the party has to find, as it goes along and it maneuvers, if it wants to win, it has to modify its message. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in the second lecture. Now, there are some other things I want to talk about. Besides nominating candidates, which we'll go over, they also unify diverse interests. And so the parties can become over time almost monolithic. So the Democrats, starting in 1932, became the party of a generation. From 1932 to 1945, many kids grew up with only knowing one president. That's very rare for you guys who grew up knowing at least three. But here we have just one. But in order to appeal to such a wide variety of party members, the party has to take what we call a modicum of not strong stance. They can't be so one way or the other that they turn off major parts of the electorate. So the parties, at least until recently, avoid taking strong stance, and sometimes this is that thing that people complain about, that there's not a difference between the parties, so why even vote then? But we also have to remember that that the U.S. Is not an ideological nation. We're unlike the European parties, which are very ideological. You definitely know which party's left, which party's right, which party's middle. In the United States, it's a little bit different because the parties try to be something for everyone. They try to cater to the left and the right, and of course the middle, which is where they have to run from. So in Western Europe, they have, I think, what's known as a party-centered system. But here in the United States, we have what's known as more of a candidate-centered system. Now, secondly, they also have to act as a moderating influence on government. And what that means is to win elections, the parties must usually nominate moderate candidates who appeal to the vast center of the American electorate. And so what happens is fringe elements gets squeezed out. And what happens when parties do nominate people from outside the mainstream, Barry Goldwater in 1964, George McGovern in 1972, you see, and in a sense Michael Dukakis in 1988, you see the party that nominates these people really suffer at the polls because the voting population generally avoids nominating fringe candidates. When I see that the Democratic left is pushing for Elizabeth Warren to run against Hillary Clinton, I'm just thinking, oh boy, you're going to see some states slip into the Republican column because the 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 issues that Elizabeth Warren espouses are not particularly popular, even in the middle. But she's a hero to the left. And we saw the Democrats make this mistake in 1972. We saw the Republicans make this mistake in 1964. Sometimes parties go off the rails. They just do. They also, again, we were just talking about this. They also create the conditions for what we call a reduction in the diffusion of power in government. So, in theory, a party brings government together in order to overcome the systems of separation of powers and checks and balances. And so, therefore, the parties are supposed to act as a unifying force. But because people split their tickets, and you're not going to find this in your book, so you need to write this down. But because people tend to split their tickets, I vote the man and woman, I don't vote the party, we get divided government. And the thing that's aided this, and we'll see this again, is that 100 years ago, the type of ballot that was common was one that was called the party column ballot. So when you went in there and you pulled the lever, it voted for every Democrat on the ballot from the top down to the bottom of the ballot. But when we started adopting the Australian ballot, which is also known as the office column ballot, the ballot itself got divided up by the office of President and Vice President, the offices of Senate, the office of your House district, and then so on and so forth. You see a position. So 2012, you saw Barack Obama and Joe Biden. You saw Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan. You saw Roseanne Barr and whoever. And your vote will be only for the office of President and Vice President. Then you slip down to the next section, and it's voting for the Senate, the U.S. Senate race in your state, and then down there the U.S. Congressional House. This is very different because this allows you to split your ticket. You're no longer beholden to the form of the ballot, and you can literally vote the way you want to. And what that has done is actually facilitate split ticket voting because it gives people far more choices. Whereas straight ticket voting is facilitated by what we call the party column ballot. Now, the party also provides what's known as patronage. Now, in theory, this should ensure that the will of the people is carried out. But in reality, the vast majority of government jobs are filled by civil service. Now, what we mean by patronage is, if you remember your U.S. history, the 1828 election put Andrew Jackson into the White House. And the White House was literally, at least the interior, was literally destroyed by people seeking offices in the government after President Jackson's inauguration. And consequently, that was the system that was in place until the assassination of James Garfield, in which prompted the passage of the Pendleton Act and the establishment of a more professional civil service, which meant that now it wasn't who you knew to get a job, though it still can be, as we'll see when we get to bureaucracy. But now, in many jobs, you had to take a test, and if you weren't qualified, you couldn't get that position. So we also know that what has happened is that people who have political connections and become part of an administration often bring that administration down. So for instance, Harding's Ohio gang has basically put a pox on the Warren G. Harding administration that exists to this day, though seemingly historic research is now saying it wasn't as bad as we perhaps thought it was. Or Nixon's Palace Guard, who counseled Nixon to pay off the Watergate plumbers, and the decision, which was aided and abetted by the Palace Guard, brought the end of Nixon's presidency. So bad people can have an effect on your system, and right now in the current administration, Valerie Jarrett is kind of getting that. He's getting a little bit of that visibility that she's trying to avoid, I think. and is she leading the Obama administration to make bad decisions? Um, Now, also one thing that they do is they also inform the public through their party platforms. The thing is, though, people usually don't read the platforms. Only if you're, I think, attending the Democratic or Republican conventions, or if you're a policy wonk, do you really look at the platforms? Because what happens is that the platforms are often very broadly worded. They're um, they're like the train platform, something you get on rather than something to stand on. And usually in the general election campaign, which occurs after the primaries, which we'll look at in the second lecture, um, the candidates kind of avoid the the platform because there's always something on there that they don't want to run on. And so consequently, platforms are there, they serve a purpose, but they're not adhered to. And finally, there is the loyal opposition that uh, the party represents when someone gets into the presidency. Now, usually there's something called the 100 days where a president gets kind of a honeymoon period. He tries to get his platform through Congress, and Congress will debate it, and they don't put too much of an effort up. But that kind of ended with Clinton, and so consequently we see this. But that's simply what the party out of power represents. They're the loyal opposition, and they do that. Now, of course, the final two, and even though they're not here, I'm going to talk about them anyways. The parties were agents of political socialization, but I'll talk more about that in a coming lecture. And again, they're a linking mechanism between the people and government. So there's lecture one. Be ready, we've got to finish political parties. We'll probably go through chapters 8 and 9, though we will hold off on elections until we come back. We'll do nominations in Congress. We've got quite a bit of stuff to do. There's almost 60 pages here that you've got to read. And then when we come back after the break from Christmas, we'll tackle elections, interest groups, the executive branch, and we'll pretty much be done by the end of March. And then it gives us a month to review. So this is the end of lecture one.